A pale hand pulls back a moonlit hood. Black gloves grip iron reins. A horse breathes white fog into the cold graveyard air. He dismounts beside a crooked old caretaker who has not slept in 3 nights. He does not bow. He does not speak. He slices his own thumb on the curve of his fang and lets one heavy ruby drop fall onto the keeper's shaking palm. The old man flinches. The drop hits skin and steams. A long iron key slides into a pale velvet glove. He turns toward the sealed crypt no one has opened in 3 centuries. He hears something on the other side of that door that should not be making any sound at all. A heartbeat. Faint. Slow. Wrong. Who could possibly be alive in there? Stay with me on this one. He had not visited this cemetery in 200 years. He had ordered the gates chained shut after the last great purge of his own bloodline. He had built a black marble wall around it and posted 3 rotating crypt keepers who served until they died of old age and were replaced by the next trembling village boy with the right surname. He had never explained why. He had never been questioned. He was the vampire king, and his word was law from the salt cliffs to the inland forest, and the crypts of the old cemetery were the one place even his own court was forbidden to ride. They whispered about it during long winters. They invented stories around the long banquet table. They said he had buried a rival there. They said he had buried a curse. They said he had buried a doorway. None of them dared say what they actually suspected, because to say it out loud was to admit they had read the oldest law of the bloodline, and to read the oldest law was already a crime. The oldest law was carved into the cornerstone of the throne room in a language older than the kingdom itself. It had only one line. Do not open what the king has sealed. Every vampire of every house had been raised on that single sentence. It was taught before the language of blood, before the etiquette of the hunt, before the long memorization of the names of the dead. It was the first thing a fledgling heard, and the last thing an elder spoke. And tonight, riding alone through black pines, the king himself was about to break it. Believe me, he knew the cost. He had written the punishment for breaking it with his own hand. In a year so long ago, he could no longer remember the names of the scribes who had watched him do it. He had a reason. He had a reason that had been growing in him for 100 years like rot inside a beam. He had started feeling her again. That was the only way he could describe it. A pressure behind his sternum. A pulse in his throat. A faint heat in the place where his own heart had last beaten 6 centuries ago, when he was still a mortal man with mortal lungs and a mortal wife. He had buried that wife himself. He had carried her body to the crypt himself. He had pressed the wax seal himself, before he was a king, before he was even truly a vampire, in that long, terrible interval between the night his old heart stopped and the night his new one began. He had been told she was ash. He had been told her body had been consumed in the fire that took half the old kingdom. He had been told there was nothing inside that crypt but soot and a name. He had paid a priest of his own bloodline a fortune in gold to swear it on the older gods. And for 600 years he had believed him. Now here's the thing. The priest had lied. The king did not know that yet, riding through the pines with one drop of his own blood drying on his thumb. He only knew that the pressure had become unbearable. He only knew that the heat behind his sternum had begun to pulse in a rhythm. He only knew that the rhythm was a heartbeat that was not his own, and that it was coming from the direction of the cemetery he had sealed and forbidden and tried for 6 centuries to forget. He had ridden out alone, without his guard, without his counselor, without even the silver-haired captain who had served his court for 90 years and had earned the right to ride at his side anywhere in the world. He had told no one. He had left his crown on the throne and ridden out in plain black velvet, with his old long sword at his hip and his ruby pendant burning faintly against his throat, because he could not bear for anyone to see what his face was about to look like when the door opened. The crypt itself stood at the back of the cemetery, against the wall of black marble he had built around the whole hill. It was a low stone vault with no windows and only one door, an iron door set into the rock with a great wax seal as thick as a man's wrist. The seal carried the print of his own old signet ring, the one he had worn when he was still a mortal husband, before the kingdom, before the bloodline, before the long centuries. He had pressed that seal himself with his own living thumb when the wax was hot, and he remembered the smell. He remembered the wax burning his skin. He remembered the priest holding his shoulder. He remembered the cold morning light, and the cold morning air, and the cold morning silence of a man who has just sealed away the only thing he ever loved. He remembered all of it, riding in, and his hands began to shake inside his black gloves, which was something his hands had not done in 400 years. The caretaker walked ahead of him with the long iron key. He was the seventh in his line. His grandfather had held the key. His great-grandfather had held it. He had inherited the post at the age of 19 and was now somewhere past 70, and his face was the face of a man who had spent half a century guarding a door he did not understand and had been forbidden to ask about. He stopped at the iron door. He bowed without lifting his eyes. He held the key out in both hands. He said, "Your blood, my king," and then he said nothing else, because he had been raised on the oldest law and he knew that to say the next word was to risk his own throat. The king did not answer him. He took the key in one gloved hand. He looked at the seal. He lifted his other gloved hand to his mouth, drew back one lip, and let his upper fang touch the dried drop on his thumb. The drop softened. The wax seal began to glow. He pressed the key into the lock. He turned it once. The iron groaned. The wax cracked along its old print, splitting his own signet face in half. The smell that came out of the crypt was not the smell of dust. It was not the smell of old stone. It was the smell of crushed white roses, which was the perfume she had worn on the night of their wedding, 600 years before, in a country whose name no one alive could pronounce anymore. He stepped back. The caretaker stepped back. The horse pulled at its reins. The iron door swung inward of its own accord, slowly, the way a door swings in a dream, and the king walked into the dark with one hand on his sword and one drop of his own blood still drying on his thumb, and his crown safe on the throne behind him. Inside the crypt there was light. That was the first impossible thing. It was not torchlight. It was not moonlight. It was a soft pale glow that came from inside the air itself, the way water glows in deep caves when there is something in the water that should not be alive. The light did not have a source. It pulsed. It pulsed in the same rhythm the king had been feeling behind his sternum for 100 years. He took 3 slow steps forward across the old stone floor and saw the stone bier in the center of the room, and the figure laid out on the bier with her hands folded across her chest, and her dark hair spread out around her face like spilled ink on snow, and his crown was not on his head, but the weight of it lifted from him anyway, and somewhere far behind him in the throne room he had left, the empty crown shifted on its velvet cushion the way a thing shifts when its master forgets it. She was not ash. She was not bone. She was not the dry brown husk that 6 centuries of sealed stone should have left behind. She was lying on the bier in the same white linen dress she had worn the morning he carried her in, and the dress was not even discolored, and her hands were folded the way he had folded them, and her face was the face he had been seeing in dreams for 600 years, and there was a faint flush of pink along the edge of her cheekbone, the way a sleeper flushes in winter, and the soft pale glow in the room was rising and falling against her ribs, and the king understood, with a cold clarity that hit him harder than any blade he had ever taken, that the pulse he had been feeling for 100 years was hers. He went down on one knee beside the bier. His sword scraped the stone. He pulled off one black glove with his teeth and reached out with a hand that was suddenly mortal again and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat. Her skin was cool. Her skin was warm. Her skin was neither. Her skin was the temperature of a thing held in a place between, and under his fingers, slow and faint and absolutely real, was a heartbeat. He counted it. He counted it for a long time. He counted it through the smell of crushed white roses and the soft pulse of the impossible light. He counted it until he was certain. Then he closed his eyes, because the last time he had felt a heartbeat under his own fingers had been the morning he sealed this door, and that one had already been slowing, and this one was not. This one was holding. This one had been holding for 600 years. He stayed like that for a long time. He did not hear the caretaker step back into the doorway. He did not hear the horse stamp in the cold cemetery air outside. He did not hear, deep beneath the stone floor of the crypt, the first slow grinding sound that a thing makes when it has been asleep for a very long time and has just been told by a broken seal that it is allowed to begin waking up. When he finally opened his eyes, the light in the crypt had dimmed by exactly one shade. The flush along her cheekbone had faded by exactly one shade. Her heartbeat under his fingers had slowed by exactly one beat. He did not understand yet what he was seeing. He thought it was the shock of the air. He thought it was the broken seal letting the cold in. He thought it was anything except what it actually was, which was that something underneath them, much older than her and much older than him and much older than the kingdom and the bloodline and the language of the oldest law, was beginning to feed on the same faint light that was keeping her alive. He laid her hand back across her chest. He stood up. He stepped out of the crypt. He told the caretaker, in a voice that did not sound like his own, to seal it. The caretaker started to obey. The wax on the door had cracked in half and could not be made whole again, and they both knew it. The king did not look back at the crypt as he walked out of the cemetery. He took the reins of his horse in one gloved hand. He rode home through the black pines. He rode all the way back to the castle before he understood that, for the first time in 600 years, he did not know what to do. The castle was quiet when he came in through the lower gate. That was the second wrong thing of the night. The castle was never quiet. It was a high Gothic court with 300 nobles and twice that many servants and a long banquet hall that ran night feasts until the third bell. He came up through the back stairs with his black cloak still around him and his ruby pendant gone dim against his throat. He passed the throne room. The empty crown was sitting on its velvet cushion at an angle, as if a wind had pushed it. There had been no wind. He did not stop to straighten it. He walked the long hall to his own private chamber and sat down in the chair by the cold fireplace and did not move for the rest of the night, while outside his window the first of his nobles, 3 corridors over, in a bed she had inherited from her grandmother, began to die without a wound. By the third dawn after the seal was broken, there were 6 of them. They were found in their own beds, with their bedclothes neatly drawn up and their hair still arranged and their faces calm. There was no bite. There was no struggle. There was no blood. They were simply empty. Not drained. Empty. The court physicians could not find a cause. The lower priests could not find a cause. The king's silver-haired captain came to him on the morning of the 4th and stood in the chamber doorway with his helmet under one arm and said, "My king, this is not natural." The king did not look up. He said, "I know." The captain waited. The king did not say anything else. The captain bowed and left. He had served the court for 90 years. He had earned the right to know. The king did not give it to him. This is where it turns. The king already understood what was happening. He had understood it the moment he stepped out of the crypt and looked back at the broken wax. He had understood it again the next night when he rode back, alone, and stood in the doorway of the vault and watched the pale soft light pulse over her chest by exactly one less shade than the night before. He had understood it a third time when he laid his fingers on her throat and felt that her heartbeat had slowed by exactly the same number of beats that his nobles had lost their lives. Something was siphoning her. Something was using the crack in the seal as a mouth. Whatever it was drawing the faint life out of her, and through her, out of the bloodline she had been sealed inside to protect. 600 years of stone had not been holding her in. 600 years of stone had been holding something else down. And she had been the lock. He did not say this to his captain. He did not say it to the long table of advisors. He did not say it to the lower priests who came to him 3 times a day, with reports of new bodies and pale empty faces and bedclothes neatly drawn up. He said only that he would handle it. He said only that the oldest law would be obeyed. He said only that no one was to ride to the cemetery without his hand on the order. The advisors looked at one another. The captain looked at the floor. The lower priests looked at their hands. Believe me, they all knew. They had counted the nights since the king had ridden out alone. They had counted the dawns since the empty bodies had started appearing. They had read enough of the oldest law, even the parts they were forbidden to read, to understand that something had been opened. They did not say it. They left the room one by one. He went back to the crypt every night. He rode out the same way, alone, in plain black velvet, with his sword at his hip and his ruby pendant going a little dimmer each time. He sat by her bier. He held her cool, warm hand. He counted her heartbeat. He watched the light dim by another shade. He did not speak to her, because he could not bear to hear how his voice would sound, and he was afraid that if he spoke she would not answer, and even more afraid that she would. He watched the crack in the wax of the broken seal, on the inside of the door, glow faintly with each beat of her heart, and he understood that the crack was a wound, and that the wound was bleeding her into the floor, and into something underneath the floor that was getting larger and hungrier by the night. He did not know what to do. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want the rest of these. There is a moment in every long story when a man stops looking for a way out and starts looking only at the door he came in through. And the king reached that moment on the 7th dawn, when the bodies in the castle reached 14, and his silver-haired captain came to him with his helmet under his arm and said, "My king, half the high houses are talking about your crown." The king lifted his head for the first time in 3 days. He said, "Talking about it how?" The captain said, "Talking about it as a thing that may need to be moved." The king did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, "Leave me." The captain bowed. He went out. The king looked at the cold fireplace and understood that the kingdom he had built out of the long centuries was about to come down on top of him from inside, and that the woman in the crypt was about to come down on top of him from outside, and that the two collapses had the same root, which was the one drop of his own royal blood that had cracked a wax seal 600 years too late. The whisper started in the lower halls first. He heard it through his captain. He heard it through his cupbearer. He heard it from the long-haired heir of the second oldest house, who came to the throne room without asking, knelt without lowering her eyes and said, "My king, the bloodline is dying." The king said, "I know." The heir of the second oldest house said, "The bloodline is dying because the seal is broken." The king said, "I know." She said, "The seal is broken because the king broke it." The king did not answer. She said, "The oldest law has only one line." The king said, "I know." She said, "Then you know what the houses will do." The king said, "I know." She bowed her head. She got up. She walked out. He did not stop her. By the next dawn there were 18 bodies, and 3 more of the high houses had pulled back from the long table, and the empty crown on the velvet cushion was sitting at an even sharper angle, and somewhere in the kitchens, a fledgling cupbearer was being told, very quietly, to start practicing the old phrase that begins a vote of removal. He went out to the crypt again that night. He rode harder than he had ridden in 3 centuries. He came in under the iron door without speaking to the old caretaker, and the caretaker did not bow this time, because the caretaker had counted his dawns too, and he knew. The king knelt by the bier. He laid his hand on her throat. Her heartbeat was very faint. The light in the crypt was almost gone. The flesh along her cheekbone was almost gone. She was almost gone. And deep below the floor, the grinding sound that he had not been able to hear on the first night had grown into something he could feel through the stone in his knees, a slow, rhythmic shifting like a great body turning over in sleep, getting ready to sit up. He understood. He had understood for days, but on the floor of the crypt that night, with her almost gone heartbeat against his fingers and a slow turning weight rising from the rock under him, he finally let himself say it inside his own head. She was the seal. She had always been the seal. The priest who had sealed her in for him 600 years ago had not been sealing her away. He had been using her. He had taken her dying mortal heart in the last few hours of her last life, and he had bound it as a lock against something the bloodline had buried under that hill long before any vampire king had ever ridden through the Black Pines. The priest had lied to him about the ash, because the priest could not bear to tell him what he had really done with the only thing he had ever loved. The priest had taken his gold and his grief and his wedding seal and his future centuries, and he had used them all to set the only kind of lock that could hold the thing underneath. A living human heart, slowed past death but not over the line, held in a perfect stasis, beating once a year for 600 years against the lid of a buried hunger. And the king himself, 6 centuries later, had walked back in with one drop of his own royal blood, and he had cracked the wax over his own wife's name, and he had begun to feed the thing under her with the only fuel that could hold it back. He had to make a choice. He had 30 hours before the long table moved against his crown. He had perhaps fewer than that before the thing under the floor finished turning over. He had perhaps fewer than that before her heartbeat stopped. He had to choose between his kingdom and the woman he had buried, and he had to make the choice in the next hour, and the choice was not what anyone in any high house could possibly have guessed, because the choice was not between her and the kingdom. The choice was between her and her. It was between the version of her that lay on the bier in the white dress with the slow-held heartbeat, and the version of her that he could wake. He could wake her. He had the blood. He had the fang. He had the breath. He could lean down right now, in the dimming light, and turn her, the way he had been turned himself 600 years ago, and she would open her eyes and look at him, and the long story would not have to end. The kingdom would still fall. The thing under the floor would still rise. Half the high houses would still die. But she would be there with him to watch it. He could have her. He could have his crown taken. He could lose the kingdom. He could have her. Or he could let her sleep. He could press the broken wax back into place with the last of his own ruby pendant, and he could lean down and lay his cold mouth against her cool, warm forehead, and he could whisper the only sentence the oldest law allowed him to whisper at a sealed door, which was, "Sleep on," and her heartbeat would slow again, and the light would brighten again, and the flush along her cheekbone would return by one shade, and the grinding sound under the floor would settle and stop and turn back over into its long sleep. And the bloodline would not fall, and the kingdom would not burn, and he would walk out of the crypt and ride home through the Black Pines and sit back down on his throne and pick up his empty crown and put it on his own head and rule for another 400 years, alone, with the perfect memory of one heartbeat held in stasis under stone, in a place he could never enter again. He had to choose. He stayed on his knees for a very long time. He chose. He pressed the last of his ruby pendant into the broken wax. He laid his cold mouth against her cool, warm forehead. He whispered, "Sleep on." He felt her heartbeat slow under his fingers and then steady. He felt the light brighten by exactly one shade. He felt the grinding sound under the floor settle and turn over slowly, the way a thing settles when it has been told, by a lock it cannot break, that it is not allowed to begin waking up. He stood up. He stepped back. He did not look at her face. He could not. He walked out of the crypt and laid his own bare palm across the cracked wax on the iron door, and he held it there until the cut on his thumb opened by itself again, and one slow ruby drop fell into the crack and sealed it, and the smell of crushed white roses cut off as cleanly as a door swinging shut. He turned around. He walked past the old caretaker without speaking. He took the reins of his horse. He rode home through the Black Pines in the long blue hour before dawn, with the sky already beginning to lift at the eastern edge of the forest, in a way he had not allowed himself to look at in 600 years. When he came in through the lower gate, the castle was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a house that has been counting and has finished counting and is waiting to be told what its number means. He walked up through the back stairs. He passed the throne room. The empty crown was sitting straight on its velvet cushion. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about his captain. He thought about the long-haired heir of the second oldest house. He thought about the lower priests and the cupbearers and the fledglings and the 18 bodies and the long table and the oldest law. He thought about her cool, warm forehead under his cold mouth. He thought about her steady heartbeat under the closed iron door. He thought about the long blue hour at the eastern edge of the forest. Then he walked into the throne room. He picked up the crown. He did not put it on. He laid it down again on the velvet cushion, very gently with both hands, the way a man lays down a thing he no longer has the right to wear. He turned to the long window behind the throne. He drew back the heavy black curtain himself. The first sliver of dawn was already across the snow on the eastern ridge. He had not seen a sunrise since he was a mortal man with mortal lungs. He stepped up to the glass. He laid both palms flat against the cold pane. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He watched the line of light climb. He felt the ruby of his pendant go cool against his throat. He felt the long centuries lift off his shoulders one at a time, the way a long cloak comes off in pieces. He thought, this is the dawn I cannot share with her. He thought she will sleep on. He thought the kingdom will hold. He thought the oldest law will hold. He thought the seal will hold. He thought I will not. The first true ray came over the ridge and hit the glass under his palms. By the time his silver-haired captain came into the throne room with his helmet under his arm, the curtain was open and the morning was bright and the crown was on the velvet cushion and the king was gone. There was a long pale mark on the floor in front of the window in the shape of a man with both hands raised, and there was a faint smell of crushed white roses in the air, and the empty crown on its cushion was sitting perfectly straight. The captain knelt in the doorway for a long time before he stood up and crossed himself in the old way of the bloodline, and walked out to give the order that would lock the cemetery gates for another 600 years. And under the iron door at the back of the cemetery, in a crypt that had been resealed with one drop of royal blood, on a stone bier in a soft pale glow that had brightened by one full shade in the night, the dark-haired woman in the white linen dress lay with her hands folded across her chest, and her heartbeat held steady, and the smell of crushed white roses kept the rock above her closed, and the slow grinding thing under the floor turned back over into its long sleep. And somewhere in the throne room of a castle far above the black pines, a crown sat alone on a velvet cushion, waiting, the way a crown waits when its master has finally chosen the one dawn he could keep.